An elderly woman in a faded military jacket sat alone in the waiting area of a US Army base. Young recruits whispered and laughed at her worn-out appearance. They didn't know she had once served in a top-secret unit the government erased from the records. If you believe forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered, please subscribe to this channel. These are real stories that honor humility, courage, and the quiet dignity that built this country. It was a quiet Saturday morning at Fort Brenton Army Base. The waiting room was full young recruits, families and base staff coming and going. In the far corner of the room, a woman in her late 60s sat completely still. Her name was Miranda Reeves, but no one there knew that. She wasn't holding a phone. She wasn't reading. Her eyes were fixed on the wall in front of her, unfocused. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers tightly gripping the edge of a green military-style jacket. The jacket was old. The fabric had faded, seams frayed, one of the collar buttons missing. The sleeves drooped. It didn't fit quite right. She looked like someone out of place, maybe even out of time. Across the room, a group of young army recruits stood in their crisp new uniforms. One of them, Private Ryan Maddox, 19, buzz-cut, overly confident, leaned toward his buddy and said just loud enough to be heard, "Looks like she stole that from a thrift shop dumpster." Several of the others laughed. One girl rolled her eyes. Someone else added, "Probably thinks she's someone important." Nobody stopped them. Nobody looked uncomfortable. The whole room just moved on except for Miranda. She didn't blink. She didn't shift in her chair. She didn't even seem to hear it. But she did. She had heard worse. She had heard men scream. She had heard silence that followed after classified orders. And now, she heard the laughter of young soldiers who didn't know what real silence meant. The green patch on her left sleeve was almost completely torn. What remained showed a falcon diving downward, claws extended, with a lightning bolt in its grip. Underneath it, faded but still legible, were 3 letters: OSR. Operation Silent Raptor. No one in that room understood what it meant. Except one. At exactly 7:53 a.m., the doors to the visitor center opened. A man stepped inside, tall, silver hair, sharply pressed uniform, chest full of medals. General Thomas Blake. He had commanded operations in 3 countries. He had spoken before Congress. He had seen action in multiple theaters. But that morning, he stopped mid-step. His eyes locked on the back of Miranda's jacket. He didn't speak. He didn't move for several seconds. The chatter in the room continued around him, but he heard none of it. His expression changed. His mouth tightened. His posture stiffened. And then, slowly, he took one step forward. Miranda Reeves lived alone in a modest rental house just a few miles outside Fort Brenton. She didn't get many visitors. There was no husband, no children, no relatives coming by for holidays. Most days, she spent in her backyard garden pulling weeds, tending to herbs, keeping busy. Neighbors knew her only as the quiet lady with the military coat. The local grocery clerk offered to carry her bags sometimes. The home health nurse who came by once a month said she never talked much, just answered what was needed, then returned to silence. Nobody really asked about her past. Nobody thought there was anything to ask. But every Saturday, without fail, Miranda caught the 9:45 a.m. bus to the base. She never checked in at the desk, never spoke to anyone, never asked for assistance. She simply walked into the waiting area, sat on the same wooden bench near the back wall, and remained still for 1 hour, sometimes longer. Then, quietly, she would leave. She never missed a Saturday, not once in over 6 years. Always wearing that same jacket. It was olive green, the kind issued to field units during the Cold War. The canvas was thin and weathered, seams frayed at the shoulders and cuffs. The right side pocket hung slightly lower from a repair job that hadn't held up. The collar was missing 1 button, but most noticeable, at least to anyone who cared to look, was the patch sewn into the left sleeve. It was circular, about 3 inches wide, barely hanging on. The image had faded almost completely, but not quite. A trained eye could still make out the shape of a bird specifically, a falcon locked mid-dive with wings swept back, its talons gripping a bolt of lightning. Beneath the bird were 3 letters: O, S, R. Most people never noticed it. To them, it was just another old patch on another old military jacket worn by someone who hadn't let go of the past. But not everyone overlooked it. Some of the young recruits at Fort Brenton had made it a habit to watch her from a distance. A few joked that she was just part of the furniture now always there, never moving, like a broken clock mounted to the wall. Others dared each other to go speak to her. She didn't smile. She didn't make eye contact. She wasn't intimidating exactly, but something about her still gave off a presence they couldn't quite explain. Most just laughed her off. A relic. A ghost. A leftover. But for those who had spent time digging through certain classified training manuals, especially the ones that didn't exist on any official record, the letters OSR carried a weight they couldn't explain, but also couldn't ignore. And that jacket didn't belong in a thrift store. It belonged to someone who had once gone where most people would never return from. Miranda Reeves sat in her usual spot. The clock above the entrance ticked past 9:45 a.m. She didn't move. The waiting room at Fort Brenton was beginning to fill with more voices. Several young recruits leaned against the far wall, halfway through their weekend rotation. They had seen the old woman before every Saturday morning. Same spot, same worn jacket. Some of them had been stationed at the base long enough to treat her like part of the background. But today, something was different. Private Ryan Maddox, 19, tall and lean, had just finished a round of early drills and was still high on adrenaline. He was always trying too hard, trying to be noticed, trying to look like leadership material. He spotted Miranda immediately. "Check it out," he muttered to his buddy Marcus, jerking his chin toward her. "Still here." Marcus, stocky and sarcastic, gave a dry grin. Maybe she thinks it's her living room. Jessica, one of the newer recruits, chuckled under her breath. "More like a VA waiting line. Yikes." Ryan took a step forward. "Hey, don't," Marcus warned, only half serious. But Ryan was already moving. He walked with that forced swagger, shoulders back, feet planted too wide like someone imitating confidence instead of living it. He approached Miranda and cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, using a tone that sounded polite on the surface but carried a bite underneath. "This area's for military families and personnel only." She didn't look up. She didn't speak. Ryan waited a beat, then added louder, "You need a sponsor to be in here, just so you know." Still nothing. The silence seemed to irritate him. He looked over his shoulder. Marcus and Jessica were watching, arms crossed, amused. A few other recruits nearby turned their heads, sensing something to gawk at. Ryan shrugged, then smirked. "That jacket," he said, gesturing toward the faded green fabric, "wouldn't pass inspection in a soup line." A couple of the others laughed. Jessica covered her mouth and shook her head. Marcus let out a loud fake cough to cover his snort. Miranda remained still. Her grip on the jacket never changed. Ryan took a step closer. "I'm serious. I think I saw something like that at Goodwill last week, but in better shape." He waited for a reaction, even a flinch. There was none. To them, this woman wasn't someone to fear or even respect. She didn't carry herself like a veteran. She wasn't standing at attention. She wasn't wearing any visible rank or ribbons. Just that old jacket with a fraying collar and a nearly torn patch on the sleeve. To a bunch of kids fresh out of basic, she looked like someone playing dress-up. An old woman clinging to stories no one asked to hear. It wasn't just the laughter that filled the room. It was the shared sense of agreement that whoever she was, her story, her presence, didn't matter. She was furniture, background noise. Then, everything stopped. Boots, heavy ones, crossing the tile floor with clean, even steps. General Thomas Blake entered the waiting area, headed toward the exit. He wasn't expecting anything unusual, but his eyes froze on the patch on Miranda's sleeve. He stopped mid-step. A split second passed. His breathing changed. His posture locked. He looked directly at Miranda's arm. His voice cut across the room. "Where did you get that?" The recruits looked around, confused. Ryan turned. "Sir?" The general didn't answer him. "That patch," he said again, pointing to the sleeve. His tone was different, now lower, firm, not angry but measured, controlled, almost respectful. Ryan blinked. "It's just, sir. I don't know. She—" The general didn't look at him. His eyes never left the jacket. The room went silent. Everyone watched now, but no one dared speak. Slowly, for the first time that morning, Miranda raised her head. Her eyes were cloudy, worn with age, but steady. She looked straight at the general without blinking. "You were OSR?" he asked softly. She nodded once. Just once. He stood still. Then, after a pause, he took a small step back. The room held its breath. The kids who had been laughing a minute earlier didn't move. Jessica lowered her phone. Marcus straightened up. Ryan took a step away, without realizing he had done it. No one laughed now. The room had just started to settle after Ryan Maddox's remark about Miranda's jacket. The recruits were still snickering among themselves. "Maybe she's just here to relive the Cold War," Jessica joked. "Or maybe she thinks we owe her something," Marcus added. "Should we salute her or offer her coffee?" Ryan leaned in again, louder this time. "Don't worry. I'm sure the VA has a seat warmer waiting. Maybe they'll issue her a new jacket if she fills out the right form." Laughter followed, not cruel in tone, but careless. Casual dismissal. That made it worse. Miranda didn't move. She didn't flinch. Not when Jessica pulled out her phone and snapped a photo from across the room. Not when someone muttered, "has been," near the vending machines. She sat still, gripping the hem of her jacket. The frayed patch on her left sleeve remained in plain view, weathered, nearly torn off but still there. A falcon mid-dive, talons locked around a lightning bolt, and 3 faded letters underneath. OSR. At exactly 10, 1A, the door at the far end of the waiting room opened. General Thomas Blake stepped inside. He wasn't just any officer. On base, he was a legend. A 32-year veteran, Blake had led special operations in 2 major conflicts, earned 6 commendations for field command, and had personally debriefed high-level POWs from both Allied and enemy forces. He didn't walk like a man looking for attention. But people noticed when he entered a room, especially when he wore the full dress uniform, as he did that morning. The general moved with purpose toward the front desk, clipboard in hand, but then he stopped. His eyes had locked onto something. No someone. Miranda. More precisely, her jacket. His gaze narrowed. He took 1 slow step forward, and then another, until he was standing in full view of the recruits and just 10 feet from Miranda. He spoke, his voice firm but flat. "Where did you get that?" The words came out like a command, not a question. Ryan turned, confused. "Sir?" Blake didn't acknowledge him. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on Miranda's sleeve. "That patch?" he said again, louder now. "Where did you get it?" Silence fell across the room. No one laughed anymore. Even Jessica lowered her phone. Ryan's mouth opened slightly, still unsure what was happening. "It's just an old jacket, sir. She's nobody. Just sits here every week." Blake didn't look at him. His tone changed not with anger, but with something harder to place. It was lower. Steadier. There was no uncertainty in it. He looked at Miranda directly. "You were OSR." For the first time since she entered the room that morning, Miranda Reeves lifted her head. Her neck moved slowly, deliberately, until her eyes met his. She nodded once. "Just once," she said, her voice dry, barely audible. Blake inhaled sharply. And then he took a step back. His voice was clear, commanding, and final. "Everyone out." He didn't shout. He didn't repeat himself. But the authority in his tone cut through the air like a blade. There was no question what he meant. "Sir, Ryan began to protest. "Now," Blake said. That was all. The recruits didn't need to be told twice. Marcus stood up first, confused but obedient. Jessica hesitated, looking down at her phone before turning it off and slipping it into her pocket. Ryan looked like he wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words. They left one by one without another word. Within 20 seconds, the room was empty, except for two people, General Thomas Blake and Miranda Reeves. Blake stood still, looking down at her as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "They told us you didn't make it out," he said. "That the entire OSR unit was lost in 79. Miranda's eyes didn't waver. Her voice was calm and low. "We weren't lost," she said. "We were buried." Blake slowly sat down on the bench beside her, not as a commanding officer, but as a soldier who understood something sacred had just surfaced in front of him. "Operation Silent Raptor," he said almost to himself. "Deep infiltration. Black Ops. Intelligence gathering behind unconfirmed lines." He glanced at the patch again. "You were the only woman in the unit, weren't you?" Miranda nodded. "I made them promise to keep it that way," she said, "for operational integrity." Her fingers lightly tapped the patch on her sleeve. She hadn't spoken of it in decades, but now, she told him what no one else had ever heard in full. She was inserted behind enemy lines without backup. She delivered real-time coordinates that allowed US forces to shut down a brutal enemy siege. Then, she was captured. She spent 14 months in a remote prison camp, presumed dead. Eventually, she was traded back in a silent exchange that never made headlines. And afterward her name, her record, her identity was wiped from every system. "For national security," she said. "They said the mission would remain classified indefinitely. I was told I no longer existed." Blake listened. He didn't interrupt. His eyes welled up not from pain, but from the weight of what he was hearing. "Why didn't you come forward?" he asked. "I did," she said, almost smiling. "No one listened. Eventually I stopped trying." The general stood, straightened his back. And then, without hesitation, he snapped into full attention. He saluted her not as a superior, but as a man paying a personal debt. "You were a ghost in our files," he said, "but you're a giant in our history." Miranda said nothing, but she gave the slightest nodone of quiet recognition. Not thanks, not pride, just acknowledgement between two people who had lived what others never would. The door behind them remained open, but the mood in the room had changed entirely. No one outside knew yet, but that would change very soon. The room was empty now, except for two people. General Thomas Blake remained standing. Miranda Reeves sat quietly on the bench, hands resting on her lap. The sunlight from the tall front windows caught the patch on her sleeve just enough to make the falcon visible again. Blake took a deep breath and slowly lowered himself onto the bench beside her. He didn't sit stiffly, like a ranking officer. He sat down as a man who had just come face to face with something he thought was long gone. They sat in silence for several seconds. Miranda didn't speak. Neither did he. Finally, Blake asked quietly, "How long have you been coming here?" Miranda's answer came slowly. "Since 2017, every Saturday, same time. And no one ever asked you why?" She shook her head. "They just assumed I was confused, or lonely, or wasting time." Blake nodded slowly, staring forward, letting the weight of it settle. "You were OSR," he said again. "Operation Silent Raptor. I haven't seen that patch in over 40 years. "It's the only one they let me keep," Miranda replied. Blake turned to her now, fully. "You were the only woman in the unit," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she replied. "And they told me it was too dangerous, that I was only on the roster to support comms. But when the mission changed, I was already in country. There was no time to pull me out." She paused. Then, for the first time in decades, Miranda Reeves began to tell her story. She had been 27 years old when she joined the unit. She wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but she was fluent in 2 languages, had a clean record, and a perfect score in code breaking. She'd passed psychological clearance for deep cover assignments and had trained in civilian infiltration strategies. Her task was to embed with a local population, gather intelligence, and send location data for weapons stockpiles believed to be hidden in a contested territory. The mission was meant to last 5 weeks. It lasted 4 days. Her coordinates were intercepted. She was captured just outside the drop zone and moved between 2 separate camps before US command even confirmed she was missing. Miranda spent 14 months in captivity. No sunlight, no contact with her unit, only interrogators and darkness. She was beaten once, hard enough to fracture a rib, and left untreated. But she never gave up the names of her handlers. After those 14 months, she was traded as part of a silent exchange. Her name never made the press. No announcement was issued. No flag was flown. "They flew me back to a base in Germany," she said. "Debriefed me for 3 days. Then someone from Washington told me my service record had been classified top secret, that I was no longer officially listed in any system tied to OSR." "Why?" Blake asked. "They said the operation had already been disbanded. No one wanted to risk exposure. The media was watching. The optics were bad. They said it was better if I disappeared. So they erased you." Miranda nodded. "They offered me an honorable discharge with a medical note. I signed it. I was tired." She looked down at her hands, fingers trembling just slightly. "I went home, found a small place outside town, took care of the yard, got by on odd jobs and some savings. I didn't need much." "Why keep coming back?" Blake asked. She looked at him. "I didn't want to disappear." Her voice didn't rise. She didn't cry. She just spoke like someone stating a fact that had been true for too long. "I figured, if someone ever remembered," she said, "they'd know where to find me." Blake didn't respond at first. His mouth was tight. His eyes were glassy. "You were never forgotten," he said. "You were buried. That's what you said earlier. You were right." He stood up. Without hesitation, Blake stood at full attention. Then formally, properly, and without ceremony, raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. Miranda looked up, surprised. He held the salute longer than regulation required. And then, softly, he said, "You deserve a monument, and we gave you a file cabinet." She blinked slowly. "I didn't want a monument, just acknowledgement." "You're getting both," he said firmly. Blake lowered his hand. He sat back down, looked over at her, and asked, "Why didn't you tell someone sooner?" "I did," Miranda said. "I filed requests, made calls, even visited a VA office once. I was told there was no record of my service. One man looked me in the eye and asked if I'd made it all up." Blake's jaw tightened. "I believe every word." "I stopped trying after that," she said. "I figured silence was easier." Blake leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice quieter now. "You didn't fail them," he said. "They failed you." Miranda didn't respond. She looked ahead at the wall, where no photos of her would ever hang. Not yet. But something had changed. For the first time, someone had listened. Someone had believed. And someone with the power to change things had just sat beside her, not as a superior officer but as a fellow soldier. That Saturday morning, the base was quiet but not with the usual sleepy calm. It was a silence filled with anticipation and something deeper, reverence. The gates opened slowly, and through them came a woman in a faded green jacket. Miranda Reeves, the same woman they had once mocked, was now being awaited. She didn't know what to expect, but what she saw next made her stop in her tracks. Lined up in full uniform was an entire row of young recruits standing at attention. No whispers, no smirks, no sideways glances, just silence and solemn respect. At the center stood Ryan Maddox, the same young man who once made jokes about her jacket. His jaw was tight. His hands shook. In one hand, he held a simple bouquet of white lilies. In the other, a folded American flag, triangle-shaped, crisp. Miranda's eyes narrowed slightly, her body stiff with old instincts. Was this ceremony meant for someone else? No, it was for her. Ryan stepped forward. His voice trembled. "We didn't know," he said. "We're sorry." Miranda didn't speak. She looked into his eyes. The same young man who once joked about her service was now barely holding his composure. He extended the bouquet with both hands, head bowed. She reached out slowly and took it, her fingers brushing his. For a moment, she didn't see a young man trying to fix a mistake. She saw a soldier learning the weight of honor. Behind them, mounted on the wall of the main building, was something new. A framed, black-and-white photograph. It showed a much younger Miranda Elise, back then in full tactical gear. The caption read, "Miranda Reeves, Operation Silent Raptor. Service without recognition. Valor beyond record." Miranda stared at it for a long moment. Her face remained still, but her eyes shimmered. One by one, the recruits approached. Not a word was spoken, but each gave her a small nod or quiet salute. Some looked ashamed, some looked deeply moved. All showed respect. From behind, General Thomas Blake stepped forward. No medals on his chest, no entourage. Just him. Plain uniform. He stood at her side, a few feet back waiting until she acknowledged him. She finally turned her head, met his eyes. "I told them," she said quietly. "Decades ago. But no one listened." Blake nodded. "That was our failure. Not yours." Miranda looked back at the plaque. "For so long," she said, "I thought the silence meant it didn't matter, that the mission was erased, and so was I." "History doesn't always arrive on time," Blake said, "but it arrives eventually." She chuckled softly. "You're still a terrible poet, General." He allowed a small smile. "That's fair." They stood there for a moment together. Two veterans of a war most had forgotten, in front of a generation just learning what sacrifice really meant. Then, something unexpected happened. The base chaplain approached. A short, quiet man in his late 50s. He cleared his throat gently and said, "Miss Reeves, we'd like to ask you to speak at next month's remembrance ceremony, not as a ghost from our files, but as a living part of our legacy." Miranda blinked. "You want me to speak?" "We want them to hear from someone who knows what it means to disappear, and still hold the line." She nodded slowly, holding the bouquet closer to her chest. Ryan Maddox stepped forward once more. "Ma'am," he said, voice steady now, "I read the full OSR file, what you did delivering those coordinates. Surviving that camp. I just want to say," he swallowed hard, "you're the kind of soldier I hope to become." Miranda finally smiled. This one, not just polite, but warm. "You already are," she said. The flag still rested in Ryan's hands. Miranda took it gently and pressed it to her heart. She didn't need medals. She didn't need a parade. But this moment? This was enough. She turned to leave, the recruits parting silently to form an honor corridor. The morning sun hit her jacket just right, and for the first time, the old patched the OSR insigniation clearly in the light. No one dared mock it now. No one ever would again. The hallway was quiet. Morning light streamed through the high windows of the base's main hall, illuminating the pale walls and polished floors. The space, once unremarkable, now carried a different weight. Miranda Reeves stepped forward slowly. To her left, near the entryway to the memorial wing, hung a new addition recently mounted, clearly polished. A photograph in black and white, framed in simple walnut. It showed a young woman in full tactical gear, sleeves rolled, boots worn, eyes alert and steady. Her name patch read, E. Reeves. The image had clearly been taken mid-operation, somewhere in the thick of it. Miranda said nothing at first. She stood in front of it, motionless. Her eyes scanned every detail, not with vanity, but with memory. She remembered that day. The heat, the dust, the weight of the gear, the pressure of silence on the radio. She remembered the moment after the photo was taken when the photographer, a field analyst, had smiled and said, "That one's for the archive." She had shrugged. She didn't expect archives to remember her. They hadn't, until now. Next to the photo, Embedded in dark brass on a rectangular plaque were 3 simple lines. Miranda Reeves, Operation Silent Raptor. Service without recognition. Valor beyond record. No rank, no commendations, no years served. Just the truth. Miranda reached out slowly and let her fingers rest gently on the edge of the plaque. It was cool to the touch, solid, permanent. She took a deep breath and let it out through her nose, steady. Behind her, footsteps approached. She didn't turn. She knew who it was. General Blake stood beside her silently, his hands behind his back. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. She finally said, "It's strange. I used to walk these halls invisible. Just another veteran with a jacket and a limp." Blake nodded. "We should have seen you. Should have asked questions when it mattered." "I wouldn't have answered," she replied with a faint smile. "Not back then." There was a pause. Then Blake said softly, "There's talk of a full ceremony. Medals, promotion, posthumous status reversal, even retroactive honors." Miranda turned her head and looked at him. "Don't," she said, calm but clear. He blinked. "You don't want it?" "I never needed it," she answered. "The mission was never about that. We weren't chasing medals. We were trying to keep others alive. That was enough." Blake exhaled. "So what do you want?" Miranda looked back at the photo. "This," she said. "A name. A story. A place where someone can stop and ask, 'Who was she?' That's all I ever needed." Blake nodded again, and this time he stood a little taller. A few young cadets walked through the corridor, slowing as they noticed Miranda. One of them paused, read the plaque, then looked at her with quiet recognition. She gave a small nod. That was enough. As they passed, one cadet whispered, "She's the one they buried the mission for." Another answered, "But she's still standing." Miranda heard it but didn't react. She looked once more at the plaque. Her younger face looked back at her, frozen in time. A girl who had faced fire, torture, silence, and erasure. A girl who had walked out of hell with the secrets of a nation in her head, and no one to believe her. Now, at last, she had been believed. She traced the brass letters once more. "Valor beyond record," she murmured aloud. For years, she had believed her service meant nothing. That anonymity had stolen not just her name, but the very meaning of her sacrifice. But now her name was etched in brass. Her story hung on the wall, and people were beginning to understand. No ceremony, no applause, just permanence. And that was everything. She stepped back from the plaque. The hall was still quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt sacred. As she turned to leave, her hand brushed the side of her old jacket. The patch Operation Silent Raptor still clung to the shoulder. Old, faded, but intact. And no one dared question it now. Outside, the sun was warmer. The air was fresh. She walked slowly but without pain. Every step grounded, measured. At the gates, a young sergeant opened the door for her. "Ma'am," he said, standing aside with respect. She nodded. "Keep walking the line, son." "I will, ma'am." She stepped out onto the pavement and paused. For years she had lived as a ghost. Now she was something else. Not a headline. Not a martyr. Not a general. Just Miranda Reeves, woman who served without applause, who endured without recognition, and who finally, quietly, took her place in history. Sometimes the bravest people walk among us without fanfare, without medals, and without their names in the history books. Miranda Reeves served in silence. She was captured, held for 14 months, and erased from the record. Yet she never asked for attention. All she wanted was to be seen. This story reminds us, recognition doesn't make someone a hero. Courage, sacrifice, and integrity do. Many older Americans, especially our veterans, caregivers, and community builders, know what it feels like to be overlooked. But your story matters. You matter. Whether or not someone hangs your photo or salutes you, what you've done has value. You've helped shape families, neighborhoods, and generations. So if you've ever felt invisible, like your work or your life was forgotten, remember Miranda. Remember how she stood tall with dignity, and in the end, was seen. If this story touched you, please consider subscribing. We bring real stories that honor quiet courage and everyday dignity. Don't miss the next one. Thank you for being here. You are not forgotten. You are not invisible. See you in the next video.